Pilate ordered Jesus flogged and then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. The soldiers took Jesus into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters, called the Praetorium, and called out the entire regiment. They dressed him in a purple robe, and they wove thorn branches into a crown and put it on his head. Then they saluted him and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And then they struck him on the head with a reed stick, spit on him, and dropped to their knees and mocked worship. When they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him again. Then they led him away to be crucified. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. They offered him wine drugged with myrrh, but he refused it. Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and cast lots to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, "King of the Jews." 2 criminals were crucified with him, one on his right and the other on his left. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Then at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This all happened on Friday, the day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath. Well, grace and peace, friends. I'm Kevin Goodshow, lead pastor for CrossWind Community Church, and I am honored that you have chosen to spend these next minutes with me reflecting on the meaning and the purpose of Good Friday. You know, this has been an unusual season of Lent. This has been an unusual journey to Easter for all of us. And at times, for some of us, it has seemed and felt difficult. For nearly a month, we have been asked to stay home and stay safe. We hear reports about people that are sick and dying. We hear about people who are laid off from their jobs, and we hear about businesses and church buildings asked to be closed. And that's the beginning of the list. Our list could go on and on. But as I said, today is Good Friday. And I believe that for many of you listening to this message, you've heard that phrase, Good Friday, for much of your lives. Many of us know the story. We know how Judas betrayed Jesus. We know how Jesus was arrested, how he was put on trial, how he was whipped, beaten, spat on, and mocked. And then how he was nailed to a cross to hang there and die. Today is Good Friday, and many of us know the story. And at first glance, we often think that there's nothing really good about it. It might as well be called Bad Friday or Black Friday. And you know, I wonder if maybe that's why so many people like to skip this night of worship. They like to move right from the hosannas of Palm Sunday right into the alleluias of Easter Sunday. I wonder sometimes if that's why pastors like myself feel so challenged to come up with some new and different way to pick out something out of the Passion story, a new way to tell the story. But the truth is, no matter how we feel about Good Friday, as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We actually believe that Jesus is God himself, fully human, fully God, fully divine. Jesus, the Son of God, God himself, died on the cross on Good Friday for us. Well, tonight, I do want to do something a little different maybe than what some of you have experienced in the past. Tonight I want to share with you my adapted version of a story that's written by a gentleman named Walter Wangerin Jr., excuse me. His story is titled The Ragman. Some of you may know the story, and maybe you've heard it in the past, but my hope is that tonight as you listen to the story, that you will have a deeper understanding for why Jesus lived, why he suffered, and why he died on a cross on that Friday. But most importantly, I hope that as you listen to this story tonight, you will understand why Jesus rose again, and it will bring to you such a great joy to experience on Easter Sunday. So hear the story about the Ragman. I saw a light so strange and experienced something so amazing that it's hard for me to explain it. If you can give me a few minutes, I'll do my best to describe it to you. Before dawn one Friday morning, I noticed a man, handsome and strong, walking through the back alleys of the city. He was pushing an old cart filled with clothes, both bright and new. As he pushed the cart, he was calling out in a clear, powerful voice, "Rags, rags, new rags for old. I'll take your tired rags." The air was foul in these dark side streets, tainted by the filth and trash that living unleashes on the world. And yet as the man called out, the air became tinged with the faint scent of cleanliness, as though the breeze that carried the sweet music of his voice also carried with it the hope and promise of a cleansing rain and a purifying wind. "Rags, new rags for old, I'll take your rags, rags." The man continued to move through the dim light of the early morning, his strong voice echoing from building to building and street to street. Now this is a curious thing, I thought to myself, for the man stood 6'4", and his arms were like tree limbs, hard and muscular. His eyes flashed with an intelligence. What was he doing here in a city that had no real need for such a useless profession? Who recycled rags anymore? Could he find no better job than this, to be a ragman in the heart of a city? But driven by my curiosity, I followed him, and I wasn't disappointed. Soon the ragman saw a woman sitting on the porch of a small house. She was crying into a handkerchief, racked with sobs as she shed 1,000 tears. Her body language said it all, as she seemed to almost fold in on herself, shoulders down, back slumped forward, her knees and elbows making a sad kind of X. She had no hope. Her heart was breaking. Her body may have been alive, but her soul wanted to die. The ragman stopped his cart. Quietly, he walked over to the woman, stepping around empty beer cans and old newspapers, dead toys and broken furniture. "Give me your rag," he said gently as he knelt beside her, "and I'll give you another." The woman looked up into his eyes, powerful, compassionate eyes, and saw something there that paused her tears. The ragman slipped the handkerchief from her hand and used it one last time to dry away the flowing tears from her face. Never taking his eyes from her, he laid across her palm a linen cloth, so clean and new that it shined. She looked down at the new cloth and then back again to the eyes of the man who had given it to her. The ragman slowly leaned forward and kissed the woman's forehead and then turned and walked back to his cart. As he began to pull his cart again, the ragman did a strange thing. He put her old, used, stained handkerchief to his own face, and then he began to weep. He sobbed as grievously as she had done, his shoulder shaking as the tears flowed down his face in a torrent of grief. But looking back to the woman on the porch, I could see that she was left without a tear. She sat with her shoulders high and a look of wonder on her face. This is amazing, I thought to myself, and I followed the sobbing ragman. Like a curious child who could not turn away from a mystery, I watched that ragman from a distance. Rags, rags, new rags for old, his voice rang out. I thought though it was still strong, it also shook with emotion as he wept. Rags, I'll take your old rags, rags. In a little while, the sky showed gray behind the rooftops, and it was light enough to make out the shredded curtains and the damaged blinds that hung in the dark windows. The ragman came upon a girl sitting on the curb whose head was wrapped in a bandage. Her eyes were as vacant as the windows around her. Her bandage was blood-soaked, and a single line of blood ran down her cheek. The ragman paused, and he turned his weeping eyes upon this empty, injured child. And reaching into his cart, he withdrew from it a beautiful yellow hat, and he walked towards the girl. Give me your rag, he said softly, and I'll give you mine. The child didn't move and could only gaze at him vacantly while he loosened the bandage, removed it from her head, and tied it to his own instead. I gasped at what I saw. With the bandage went the wound. The girl's head was left unblemished while the ragman's head began to bleed. He set the hat on the girl's head, and suddenly her eyes looked on, and an understanding and intelligence that had been missing before. She placed her hand to the side of her head where the bandage had covered the wound that was no longer there. Smiling in wonder, she watched as the ragman rose unsteadily to his feet and moved back to his cart. Rags, rags, I'll take your old rags, cried out the sobbing and bleeding ragman. New rags for old rags. With his powerful arms pulling the cart, he continued on his way. He seemed to be moving faster now with an urgency I hadn't noticed before. He stopped again in front of a man who was leaning against a telephone pole. Are you going to work? He asked. The man shook his head. The ragman pressed him. Do you have a job? The man looked him up and down, making note of the ragman's weeping eyes and bleeding head before he replied, Are you crazy? As he leaned away from the pole, revealing that the right sleeve of his jacket was flat and the cuff was tucked into the pocket. He had no arm. Give me your jacket, said the ragman firmly, and I'll give you mine. Such quiet authority in his voice. The one-armed man looked into the other's eyes and then slowly took off his jacket. And so did the ragman. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief as I trembled at what I saw. The ragman's arm stayed in its sleeve, and when the other man put on the ragman's jacket, he had two good arms, strong as tree limbs. But the ragman was left with one. Go to work, he said, as he moved back to his cart. Struggling to make do with one arm, the ragman began to pull his cart again, this time much faster and with greater urgency. He came upon an unconscious man lying beneath an old army blanket, hunched over, wheezing and sick. He took that blanket and he wrapped it around himself. But for the man, he left new clothes. Now I had to run to keep up with the ragman. He was weeping uncontrollably and bleeding freely from his forehead. He struggled to pull that cart with one arm while stumbling from drunkenness, falling again and again, exhausted, old, and sick. And yet he moved with incredible speed, nearly sprinting through the alleys of the city, covering block after block, mile after mile. I wept to see the changes in this man. I hurt to see his sorrow. I ached each time I saw him stumble and fall. When he began to move through the industrial area of the city, away from the houses and apartments, I wanted to stop following. I wanted to turn away from my grief, to leave it behind and to go back to my life. But I couldn't. I needed to see this sad, yet amazing story to its end. Who was this ragman? Why had he done what nobody else could have done? Where was he going in such a hurry? How would it all end? Well, the once strong ragman was now old and frail, weeping and bleeding, staggering and falling, his body racked with pain, sorrow, and disease. I watched as he came to an old abandoned lot that was filled with piles of trash and old furniture and the rusted out shells of cars and construction equipment. He moved among those garbage pits and piles of human refuse and finally climbed to the top of a small hill made from the trash of 1,000 lives. He struggled to pull his cart, its sad, pathetic burden. With tormented labor, he cleared a little space on that hill, and with a deep sigh, he slowly made a bed from the contents of his cart, and he lay down on it. He pillowed his head on a handkerchief and a jacket. He covered his old aching bones with an army blanket. His body shook under the load of its injuries and pain and disease. His eyes wept, and the wound under his bandage continued to bleed. And then, with one last deep sigh, the ragman closed his eyes and died. Oh, how I cried to witness that death. I sat down in an old abandoned car and wailed and mourned and as one who had no hope. I wept because I had come to love the ragman. I had followed him. I had watched him work wonders and change lives so profoundly, and it didn't seem fair that he was gone. He had taken all those things that were soiled and damaged beyond repair, and he had replaced them with new and the whole. He had offered hope to the damaged and lost of the city. But if the ragman was gone, then my hope was gone as well. I felt such an overwhelming sense of grief and loss that I remained in that rusted out old car and just sobbed myself to sleep. I didn't know. How could I know that I slept through Friday night and Saturday and on into Saturday night as well? And then on Sunday morning, I was awakened by a power that shook me to the core of my being. A light, pure, hard, an insistent light slammed against my tear-stained face and demanded that I wake. When I was finally able to open my eyes, I blinked against that light, and I squinted in the direction of the pile of trash where the ragman's body had been. And as I looked, I saw the last and the first wonder of all. The ragman was there. Oh, yes, he was there. But he was no longer dead. He was alive. There he stood, folding that old army blanket carefully and laying it atop the neatly arranged handkerchief and jacket. Besides the scar on his forehead, there was no other evidence of what he had previously taken upon himself. There was no sign of sorrow or age or no evidence of illness or deformity. His body was whole and strong, and all the rags that he had gathered, they shined with cleanliness. I wept to see him again. And when I thought that hope had died along with the ragman, I had abandoned any and all hope for my own life, and yet here he stood, healthy and whole before me. Climbing from my shelter, I moved towards the ragman, trembling from what I had seen because of what I knew that I needed to do. Walking to him with my head lowered, I spoke my name to him with shame. Looking up into his clear, loving, compassionate eyes, I spoke with a new yearning in my voice. Rags, please take my tired rags and replace them with new ones. And he did just that. Taking the old, tired rags of my existence that covered the grief and the wounds of a life sadly lived, he replaced them. He replaced them with new clothes of a life spent following him. He put new rags on me, and now I am a reflection of the hope that he offers to all. The ragman, the Christ. Well, friends, before we end this time of worship together with a song that's been prepared for us, I want to just leave you with these words from Isaiah chapter 53. I'm going to begin reading at verse 3. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. It was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrow that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion and crushed for our sins. He was beaten so that we could be whole. He was whipped so that we could be healed. And all of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to try and follow our own, and yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. And then hear these words from 1 Peter chapter 2. He never sinned, nor deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted or threatened revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. And friends, the good news of this Good Friday is by his wounds, we are healed. Friends, may God bless you in the remainder of your journey towards Easter Sunday. Let's join our voices, if you'd like, in this song of worship.
On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross with the dearest and best for a world of lost was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. To the old rugged cross I'll forever be true. His shame and reproach I gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. And I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange